This new book was published by the Zhongwen Daxue Chubanshu Chinese University Press just before things got really bad in Hong Kong. Because there are elements of the book, of course, that he was very upset by Tiananmen, and the book sort of started when he was in his late 80s. Because his dates, as you'll see, go from 1897 to 2004, the entire 20th century. Amazing. That allows me as a biographer to cover the entire 20th century, modern Chinese history, and in fact in international history, as you'll see, if you don't know too much about him. My theme here initially is that biography is not taken that seriously, especially in academic discourse, as a subject of sort of serious history, either in China or outside of China, in Western countries, I think. And I'm trying to correct that a little bit here today. The Western tradition of biography has a long history, and I'll get to the Chinese too in a minute. Hagiography, which was the life of the saints, shengdu zhuanji in Chinese. And then it develops into all kinds of popular lives. And we have biographies, sometimes pretty good, in movies, like the movie about Oppenheimer, if you remember, which I bet a lot of you have seen. And often they're done pretty well. There often is, too, sometimes literary biographies of particular authors. And they get into psychological studies and so on, but not very much about history. I did, as you may know, with my now-deceased wife, write a biography of Agnes Smedley that's published in 1988. And we tried in that book to include the background around her, so this is not my first foray, so to speak, in all of this. But as I say, in academia, this is all kind of frowned on. You don't have PhD dissertations that are biographies, at least advisors, oh no, you shouldn't do that, it's not a good idea. The Chinese tradition is also a hagiography in a sense. It's a long, complicated tradition, as most of you know. And there's the Liezhuan, the Nianpu, Jiapu, Shihua, and so on. There was an interesting article in zhuanji Wenxue, you know, the Taiwan journal, about the long history of Chinese biography that came out fairly recently. I thought was interesting. And then we have the problem today, the internet. We have Baidu, but also Wikipedia snippets that are biographies. And Wikipedia, of course, is very good, but still brief. Now we have AI snapshots of one kind or another. There's this whole internet, of course, snap biographies that I think don't do justice to the historical range. It's the same problem, in other words, whether you're looking at Chinese zhuanji or Western zhuanji, so to speak, Western biography. My talk today is a kind of intended as a defense biography. It can be rich in historical context and throw some new light on old questions, at least in this case in the 20th century history, internationally and of China. Chen Hansheng's life runs through the entire 20th century, as I just suggested by his dates. He was a major public intellectual, political activist, a social scientist of quite considerable importance, and an international figure in a variety of ways that I'll try to talk about. If I come to the end of this, maybe you'll say, yes, you can look at him, and you're looking at Chinese history in some new ways. Now, who was Chen Hansheng? Because most of you are probably not, he's not a household name exactly, although he was quite well known in Washington and New York in the 1930s and 40s. And he was very active in this region. And he had all kinds of contacts up through FDR, Roosevelt, and so on. I'll get to that in a minute. This has been quite a journey for me. In July 1979, there I am. And this is out of near Donghuamin in a collapsing old estate, half of which was destroyed already, that he was still living in with the roof falling in and so on. In 1979, this is very close to the Cultural Revolution still. He was in his mid-80s. I did first go to China earlier, in 1972, with the Committee of Concerned Asian Studies. So I was somewhat known, and I had met him earlier in relation to Agnes Smedley, who he was a big friend of. He announced to me this time, when I saw him roughly at this point, that he wanted to dictate an autobiography to me in English. definitely in English. No tapes. This is quite close to the Cultural Revolution. He didn't want that kind of thing. And he didn't want it in Chinese. He was going to say a lot of things, and he didn't. He wanted a Westerner to study of his life. There are biographies of him in Chinese, by the way, and I don't mean to say they don't exist. So for the next 2 years, we saw each other quite regularly because I was working in China for those 2 years from 79 to 81 in the Chinese Academy of Social Science, but actually really my hanwei, my employer, was the People's Daily, Renmin Herbal. And I was teaching journalists who were going to go abroad for the first time in 20 years to Western countries, and I was supposed to explain to them what the West was like. Culture, politics, economics. It was interesting. Well, they were all sons, only boys could go abroad, like into those dangerous places. They were all high cadres, sons. The most famous of them was Bo Xilai, who of course now is living a private life in a prison. And he stayed in touch with me, by the way, just almost the last moment of being arrested. Anyway, so he dictated, back to Chen Hansheng, he dictated to me. We saw each other either weekly or bi-weekly, rather quite regularly. And I had a fat notebook. I would write down in English what he had said to me, and then he made me read it back to him and make corrections. His English is very good, and you'll see why as we go on. He published in many languages, but a lot of important works in English in the 30s and 40s. The transcript, by the way, of all of this, I did finally type up 20 years later or 15 years later in TypeScript, and it does exist with the website of the Hong Kong University Press. You press a button, you can find it, and I'm trying to deposit it in certain places too as well. It runs 200 pages. It's sort of unedited, only roughly edited. I did not try to change it. It's a little circular and so on, but it's very interesting, and it's his voice, basically. He was born in Wuxi in central China, upper class family, pretty upper class. Sort of, he would say fallen gentry, it was something like that. He had very good classical education, personal tutor and that kind of things. And that was clear all through his life. Then he went to Changsha, Mingde Middle School, if you know that, a famous middle school in Changsha. He really wanted to go to the States and study botany. And he wanted to go and study the navel orange, remember, was created by Luther Burbank. And he thought, God, that's great. And he wants to be in that world. The trouble is, his eyes were very bad, even at an early age. He ends up in Pomona College in 1916. He tries to do biology, and he's very good on tests and things. But when he got to the lab, he couldn't see a damn thing. and they said, nah, this, you got to stop. But he was doing terrifically well in the humanities, in the literature and social sciences. Obviously, he was a brilliant man, and his English was extremely good. He's the only Chinese in the Pomona Literary Society, Shakespeare, so on. As I recall, he was the editor of the journal, something like that. There were some other Chinese students that came to Pomona. Some became important, but they all stayed with math and statistics, and they went in a different direction. Here he is in Pomona. I'm just giving you a slight smattering here. There's more in the book, a lot more. Fortunately, the family, I could come up with some of these pictures. He graduates from Pomona in 1920 and marries Gu Shuxing, who was getting an MA at Berkeley, but also was from Wuxi, which pleased his mother no end, of course, and was from a very famous Gu family that goes back to the Donglin Shuyan, in Wuxi. They get married actually in Seattle. He goes to the University of Chicago. He gets he's done, super well. And he writes an MA thesis on how World War I started. And it's quite an amazing MA thesis. Still, it's now in Chinese translation, I believe, and available. He could go on to Harvard and last about a semester because both he and Gushu thinks it's too expensive. She's heading to work on the side. He did have a fellowship, but and he was not too happy there. He had already started studying Russian at Chicago and probably some German. I've forgotten about that. They up and go to Europe, and as he explained to me, 15 US dollars you could live for a month on in Berlin in 1923. So why not? And he studied, of course, in Eastern European politics and history there, got a PhD, and this is what that picture is from, the middle one, I think, as I recall, is from that time. In 1924, Tsai Yuen-pei, who had been, was sort of president of Peking University. It's a little complicated when I say sort of, it's a little complicated. But he was in Berlin at that time, and he meets Chen Hansheng. Now, I should also say, and I'll circle back to this maybe a little bit, that he was politically nationalistic, but he did not participate in the Chinese Communist Party activities in Europe, really. They traveled around and so on. But he was kind of a liberal. I mean, and when he was at Pomona, he wrote a long paper, Woodrow Wilson, what a great guy he is, and, you know, stuff like that. But Tsai Yuen-pei, teacher of world history, global history, international relations, maybe legal questions and constitutions and things like that. So he recruits him to be a professor at Beida, and he arrives at Beida then at age 27. He's immediately in Beida at first in a circle of people which includes Hu Shi, Wang Shijie, all kinds of people, Li Dachao. Increasingly, Li Dachao, who some of you know is one of the founders of the Chinese Communist Party, was quite a personality. He becomes under that influence. It's only at that time, and this is one of my points, which is we have a sort of stereotype of Chinese communists and Chinese intellectuals. The big event is the May 4th movement, the 1919. Now, he was 22 in 1919, not really affected other than nationalism, yes, and he did participate in some student activities in the U.S., you know, protesting the treatment of China and stuff, but he was not suddenly off into the whole May 4th movement thing. But he does fall under, in 25, going into 26, the influence of Li Dachao, and he begins to have contact with the Russian embassy in Beijing, and he joins the International Comintern. He did not join the Chinese Communist Party, and this is another aspect of his career that doesn't quite fit the stereotype, until 1936, and I'll get to that. He deliberately is in the Guoji Gongchanda, which is the International Communist Party, and he is writing for Impracor in English. It's published, I think, in Berlin or someplace. It wasn't published in Moscow at that time, as I understand. And so he's beginning to, and he wrote about Chinese politics or world politics to some degree. Then in 1926, there's a huge event that really did shake him and Gu Shuxing up. She was very interested after Berlin in photography. She had these Leica cameras, beginning to be very interested in that and even teaching about it in Beijing. She too joins the International Communist Party. In 1926, on March 18th, there is a big incident, basically in Tiananmen Square, actually off it, but it's a technicality sort of. The soldiers of zhuanji Rei shoot students. It's brutal. And Li Dachao was wounded, I believe, I think. Lu Xun was there. Remember, Lu Xun was in Beijing. They become quite radicalized by that event in a lot of ways. And he wrote an account of it right away that was publicized a lot. And Gu Shuxing took photos that were posted. They couldn't get into a newspaper, but they were all over the place. And she got into big trouble. She had to leave immediately and leave the country because they were trying to hunt her down of slaughtered students and that kind of thing. She goes to Moscow for a little bit. And then in 1927, the Beida politics and this kind of conversion that he has is there were different cliques, and it was very complicated. There was warlords in control, but also there were very different cliques. There was the sort of French-speaking clique and the English. And he was criticized a lot when he first got there, partially because he was so young, but also he had this heavy Wuxi accent, which he still had when I knew it too. And they called him, he's the baby professor, you know, the baby professor. Well, the baby professor was still a professor at Beida in 2004. In 1927, Li Dachao is arrested and assassinated, or executed, I should say, brutally. Chen Hansheng had seen him 2 days before that happened, actually, where he was. I think he was in the Manchurian Railroad place. Anyway, it's a complicated story how it happened. There was a kind of betrayal. He was kind of semi-hiding from the warlord in charge of Beijing at that time. With that happening, both he and Gu Shuxing, who had come back from Moscow actually, said, okay, they better get out of town. And they were in hiding and they were hiding, and Gu Xixing had a sister who married high into the government, so to speak. Her husband was in the Ministry of Railroads and had a kind of mansion, and they were hiding there. But anyway, with some help from Japanese, and I don't know if you know about the history of this time, Japanese were part of the mix. They got to Tianjin and out to Moscow. Now, this was an important period in Moscow, only a year, but it's something I try to talk about in the book. And he himself was only partially discussed it, I thought, accurately, later in a Chinese autobiography. And that is that right at the end, and he says he had a meeting with Cai Heshun, a communist who was emphasizing peasant revolution, so to speak. And there also was a guy named Peng Pai, who some of you would know, who died in Guangdong organizing peasants. And this is sort of the first time, it's sort of like light bulb went off or something. Maybe that's entirely true. He did meet him. Whether the light bulb went off exactly this way, I don't know. But he goes, and he's the only Chinese in the very high-level International Agrarian Institute in Moscow, where Russians are debating the nature of the Russian peasant and the Russian village and how you understand it in Marxist terms or non-Marxist terms, and so on. And this is a predecessor to what kind of reforms they should have. The rural situation in Russia was not great, and it also was the time of Bukharin reforms, so this was still going on. In fact, Chen Hansheng lived with Bukharin's father at that time. So he witnessed these debates, and they involved serious analysis of what's going on in Russian villages in a granular way, of family income and so on. There was a very heated debate about this going on. And he saw all that. Chernikov was one of the people who is still well known today. Philip Wong loves Chernikov, for example. So I think he picked up a lot. There was another figure named Magyar, who was supposed to be the specialist on Asia, who was a Hungarian Marxist, who was later executed by Stalin, but anyway. And he had been to China briefly, but knew no Chinese, but he had a big book about, Oriental despotism, the Asian mode of production. And Chen Hansheng was argued with him a lot about this sort of Hegelian, traditional Marxist view, feudal medieval society. There was no change in agriculture for 2,000 years and stuff like that. So they did argue, and that's what he emphasizes sometimes in his own accounts. But I think this other aspect was quite important because he leaves Moscow in 1928, again with some, it's a little complicated, but with some help by Cai Yuanpei, who's back now setting up the Academia Sinica, Zhongyang Yanzhouyan, in Shanghai and Nanjing, but a lot in Shanghai. And he puts Chen Hansheng in charge of social science, basically. It's one reason why there is no social science institute in Taiwan, by the way, I believe. I think one of his more major important aspects between 1930 and 1934, roughly, and that is the rural surveys. He organizes 300, 400, 500 groups, many of them from Wuxi, high school graduates, mostly men, to do granular rural peasant villages and what is their income and what's going on. There was an argument going on. There were other kinds of social scientists with Western influences that, like John Lessing Buck and so on, that he was maybe trying to contrast with. But it's north, south, central. He does Baoding, he does Manchuria, he does Shandong. Wuxi, of course, starts in Wuxi practically. And a lot of these guys were from Wuxi. They were mostly guys. Xie Mu Chao was one of them, who became so important in the PRC in the 50s and later in the 80s. And Sun Yat-fan was another one who was an important figure later, these proteges of his. And they kind of learned, because they weren't trained as economists. I mean, he wasn't exactly, but he had this Russian, he worked it up. And also Guangdong, I mean, just all the way down. And so the publications began to come out. But also he started in 1932, 33, first with Chiang Kai-shek money from the Zhongyang Yanzhouyan, but secondly with Rockefeller money, and I'll get into that, because he had using his international connections that I'll talk with the Institute of Pacific Relations, I'll talk to a little bit more about these studies. And he wrote a number of them, some in English, and some of them were not published in Chinese till much later, which I think hurt his reputation in China perhaps a little bit, to some degree, I don't know. They started a journal called Zhongguo Nunsun with these proteges of his, and they published the Chinese Village. And this Chinese Village came out 4 issues a year, I guess, or something like that, I can't remember. But anyway, it was a Marxist analysis of the Chinese countryside, not directly tied to the Chinese Communist Party. Some of it refuting Westernite, the Buck and so on. Chen Hansheng, if you've heard of him, became later well known. And this went on till 1943, till Chiang Kai-shek did shut it down. But it was indirectly connected to the Communist Party. But remember, Mao and his group were in Jiangxi. And in the traditional history we get these days, Mao invented the analysis of rich peasant, poor peasant, middle peasant, Pinnong, Zhongnong, and so on. A lot of Chinese scholars, even today, as time has gone on, said, no, it's these guys. They developed this whole elaborate analysis in the 30s of Chinese, of class analysis of the Chinese village and what is going on with the Chinese village. Not as a blueprint for revolution necessarily. Mao did write a little bit about it, but he had no tools to analyze. He just sent cadres somewhere, and they probably wrote back to him what he wanted to hear. I mean, I don't know. This was very important, and I think even now, when I was in my trip to Beijing this summer, still acknowledge that. I mean, it may not be popularly seen that way. But anyway, so this was very important, his work that way. And it also was published in New York, Shanghai, and so on. Another dimension of his work as a public intellectual, at the same time, it's amazing what his energy. He was opposing in various ways in the media and in speeches, Chinese media and English media in Shanghai, Chiang Kai-shek's regime, essentially. And he was closely aligned with Sung Jingling, Madame Sung, Sun Yat-sen's widow. And he had begun to know her in 1929, and then by 1931, they were working together again when she came back from Moscow, actually. She, as you probably know, also had joined the international communist movement about the same time he did. They maybe met in Germany. I've never quite, they did perhaps in passing, but they became very close from that time until she died. In fact, he was her ghostwriter in many ways, I believe. Her English was better than her Chinese in a lot of ways. Remember her education, like Madame Chiang Kai-shek, especially her Chinese, written and so on. She spoke Chinese fine, but anyway. So they were very close. They were involved in all kinds of movements. And at this time, Chiang Kai-shek's people were beginning to assassinate people critical of the regime and all of that. But anyway, there's a great deal of activity of that, and I try to write about that in the book. This is a picture of him at Beida, see the baby professor on the far left. This is now in Shanghai, and this is the Institute of Pacific Relations in 1933 in a meeting in Banff. They had these huge biannual meetings, and the China Council was quite huge and very active. Chen Hansheng's to the far right with the glasses. That's Hu Shi in the middle, and so on. It was a very important part of the Chinese intellectual scene at that time. Now, on the left, Ruth Kaczynski, better known as Agent Sonia, who was one of the world's greatest Moscow spies. And she was just getting started at that time and kind of joining the Comintern, in part under the influence of this guy, Richard Zorga. I don't know if you've ever heard of him, but if you look him up in Wikipedia, he is a huge hero in Russia, still, but also maybe one of the world's most successful international espionage guys. He was pretending to be a German and was high in the German hierarchy already in Shanghai, and of course would not speak Russian or anything like that. Chen Hansheng worked with him some on some of his projects out to the northwest, out where Yan Xishan was and so on, to see what was going on with Chiang Kai-shek's troops. And he was kind of interested in the military intelligence, as you might suppose. But he did have an association with him, and so because of that, Chen Hansheng's association with Sorg is quite blown up in terms of his overall reputation, and I'll get to that. But also Ruth Kaczynski. Agnes Smedley is part of the picture, and I'll show you a picture of her later. She's quite active in this whole thing in 32, 33. Shanghai was a wild place in those years, so there is this aspect of it. Interestingly enough, there's also a famous Japanese named Ozaki Hatsumi, who later was with Sorg in Tokyo in 44. They were both hung. I think they were arrested in 42, something like that, right? And so there was a lot going on at that time. But the Chinese communist underground, which was in trouble at that, had been decimated by various things, in Shanghai. Pan Han-nian was the head of the sort of party. And Chiang Kai-shek and Sung Ching-ling kind of kept their distance from him. I think he did cross paths with him, but he said they were careful not to be associated necessarily with Pan and his underground Chinese communist activities. So there's an interesting difference, which I think is not always in the history too well. Because they were being public intellectuals. Yes, they were of a communist persuasion, but not tied to the Chinese party directly. And so that was the idea. And they were effective propagandists. I mean, Sung Ching-ling and Chen Hansheng and so on. There was a League of Civil Rights, I guess it was called, in Shanghai there that was influential for about 6 months, and then Chiang Kai-shek assassinates the leader of it. And Sung Ching-ling always didn't want Chen to be the first name because he didn't want him to get assassinated, essentially. He was active in all of this thing. One of the points I like to make, though, at the same time, people around Chiang Kai-shek and intellectuals and political figures, many of whom he knew at Beida or at Peking University earlier, were floating around, like Wang Shiwei, but also Wang Jingwei, who later was in the Chiang Kai-shek's government. Wang Jingwei invites Chen Hansheng to join him. I mean, he had contact with all of these people. Another was Chen Lifu, who was a key figure in the Kuomintang business. You see, Chen Lifu was an overseas Chinese, had studied in America. It was a very fluid situation. He could mix with a whole variety of people. It wasn't just radical leftists, rightists. It was a much more moving interactions. He asked me once to take a letter to Chen Lifu in Taipei, believe it or not, in the late 80s. It was interesting. And I think that's an important point. Okay, after that, there's a brief period in 34, 36, in Japan, mostly actually producing some really very important scholarship. He does develop a relationship with Guo Moreau, who was in Japan at that time, and their relationship is an interesting one. He then is recruited, essentially, by the Institute of Pacific Relations, Taiping Yang Yanzhouhui, which that was part of. But he joins the Secretariat in New York, and they publishing Pacific Affair, a number of journals. They were quite influential internationally in about 7 or 8 countries, all had consuls like this China one, including the Japanese. And so he was an important figure from 36 to 39 in New York, operating and giving public speeches as a public intellectual partially, but also as part of the organizational activities. And so this really established contacts of all kinds in Washington, as well as New York and Boston and what have you. It raises the question, and maybe we talk about this maybe more in answers. Chen Hansheng has been accused of being a spy, a Towu or a Qingbao guy in Shanghai, Tokyo, Moscow, New York, both in the 30s and 40s and so on. One of the people that really goes after him about all this is Miles Yu, who lives around here. Yu Maojun, who you may know, very right-wing with the first Trump administration. One of those who really went after Chen Hansheng and some of his academic writing. So the issue of what is a spy is an interesting one, I think, an important one. I try to discuss it in the book in relation to Chen Hansheng, who was not doing espionage about military movements. He was doing informational things of one kind or another, but he did have contact with some of these people, so it's complicated and an important subject, I think, in terms of Chinese history, in some ways other people's histories too. He then gets a letter from Zhou Enlai in 1939 saying, "You got to go to Hong Kong, both of you," he and Gu Shuxing, because Madame Sung Ching-ling is in a bad way. She wants you to get there right now. And so he does. And she meets him at the airport, the old Kai-Tak airport. She was sort of psychologically, I think, from what he tells me, a little shaky. I mean, remember what she had gone through. And anyway, he works with her, but then he works with the Indusco, the Gung He movement, and becomes the critical sort of international secretary, having to do with raising money, but also going into the interior in various ways. We associate this with some foreigners like Rui Ali, who Chen Hansheng, of course, knew, but he was very active in that until, of course, 1941. Because of his contacts in New York with the Institute of Pacific Relations, he was in the Treasury Department related to Morgenthau and so on. Chen Hansheng debriefs him when he goes through Hong Kong The Chiang Kai-shek people go bananas. I mean, wait a minute, because it influences American policy. The same guy makes another trip in 42, but by that time, the Japanese have taken Hong Kong. Chen Hansheng barely gets out of Hong Kong, and they end up in Guilin. And maybe I'm going to have to skip that part of it, where he's involved a variety of propaganda activities. And it was quite important, the center, Guilin itself, not just Kunming and so on. He then gets another message. What happens, there's an attempt to assassinate him. And the local warlord in Guilin, who is under Bai Zhongqi, gives him a phone call and says, you better get out of town fast because Chongqing has just sent hitmen to get you. And with British help, because he was in touch internationally a lot, and that's what it really angered the people in Chongqing, was his influence with the press and with Western diplomats. So he and his wife go to India for 2 years, from 1944 to 46, and he becomes quite active in India. And there are almost no communist-oriented leftists in India, really, and he's in Delhi. Yu Ma-chun said he was a spy, working for the British now. That's not true. So the British did pay his way to do propaganda work against the Japanese. And that was an issue in India because some Indians were sympathetic to the Japanese for obvious reasons. Anyway, he is very active there and gets to know people are coming out of jail, Nehru, for example, and a number of other later, comes quite close to an Indian Marxist named Ranga. And they do rural studies, Indian villages, and comparative to Chinese villages. A very important work that is only published much, much later. Later on, he works at it at Johns Hopkins in the late 40s. Then he gets a letter, again from Zhou Enlai, hand-delivered. The guy who did it, I actually knew, and said, you got to go to New York. We want you in New York. And so he goes to New York, and he's head of the Chinese Communist Party in New York. I forgot to tell you that in 1936, in Moscow, on his way to New York, actually, from Japan, he joined the Chinese Communist Party with Wang Ming and Kang Sheng as his introducers. Kang Sheng's wife had been his student once, and so anyway. He goes to the United States and works with the underground, organizing students, Chinese students who had come, were studying, mostly men, but not entirely, and they were all in the sciences, but the idea, organizing them to go back to China once it's liberated. They were all from upper-class families, of course. So it was modestly successful. I think about 1,000 did that. Maybe some of them really regretted it later. That's another issue. But anyway, he was active that way. And he had a group of young students who had joined the party or were joining the party about that time, who were important in various ways. He also sent regular reports, and here's a certain kind of spy stuff, to a man named Lee Cannon, who was the international intelligence, more important than Kang Sheng, really, a minister with Mao in Yan'an, about what was going on in American politics. What was the situation, basically, in that way. So he develops a close relationship this way with this man, Lee Cannon. And that leads us to leaving. The FBI is knocking at his door by 1950. They depart, and they arrive in Beijing, the old railway station, early 1951, and Lee Cannon is there to greet him. He has a dinner with Zhou Enlai, Lee Cannon, and so on, and he's invited to be a minister, a vice minister. If he doesn't like that, he could be president of Peking University or something. And he said, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that. And one of the reasons he told me, he had a kind of nice Chinese explanation about chopsticks and forks and things, but table manners and stuff. But the real reason is he told me he had been in Moscow in 1928, and he was in Moscow again in 1936, and everybody he knew and loved from 28 were all gone. And he could see the Russian influence in China already in 51, 52. He said, I want to have a long life, which he did. So he declined that, and he had various advisory positions and did publishing, but in some ways it harmed his, I guess, career as he might have had in the PRC. But on the other hand, I think the long life point is well taken. There is the PRC period. Some people like to say he was a kind of gadfly in the 50s, and he was active in the 50s in opening up relations with India. He was very involved in the Indian relations, and I try to go into that, how both India and China screw up that relationship. Also, Bandung, which was in 1955, a number of his proteges were involved in that. Even the Panmunjom translators were his students from America in the 40s, the Pooh brothers, I don't know if you know who they are, Pooh Shan and some others. He was very involved in that in the 50s, also international delegations that had to do with trade, outside of trade with Moscow. There was another man named Ji Jiaoding who has a very interesting parallel career we could talk about. Then there was these big events like the anti-rightist, and he was pretty outspoken. Everybody told me that. Almost everybody around him was sent far, far away. Some of them didn't come back till well after the Cultural Revolution. Some did, but not him. And he was protected. How he was protected is probably Li Kenung, who was the Ministry of Security and the Vice Foreign Ministry. He had a couple of hats at this time. Or Sun Jingling. I mean, that's another story I heard that she said, "You touch him, I'm leaving the country." You know, I don't know if that's true, but might be. He escaped that, but he was still put on the shelf. And there was other sort of international figures who became more important. Tang Mingjiao, if you ever heard of him, Nancy Tang's father, became close to Mao as his translator, interpreter about America. And Sun Jingling, they both lost influence over some of their projects after that. He also started a library, an institute library, that was quite important and active in the middle 50s, collecting books on the West and daily newspapers that came out from Hong Kong and so on as a resource that later developed into a library in the foreign ministry. In economic policy, he was quite upset, really. Well, he had seen collectivization in Russia, and that was one of the things being debated also in the late 20s. Stalin was just moving in. He wanted to see cooperatives, agricultural cooperatives, and there was a movement to that in the PRC till about 1955. I won't get into the personalities. Foreign ministry was his position, so he was a sort of outside advisor, although all of these people like Xue Muqiao and Sun Yat-fan, saw him all the time, and he would rail at them about don't push into collectivization. Also, he thought light industry should be developed, not heavy industry. And he had written about that in the 40s, a lot, in Chinese mostly, pretty much ignored, I think. So he was not happy about that aspect of things as well. This is him with Agnes Smedley in New York in about 1947-48. This is with Elsie Chumley with the Institute of Pacific Relations in the far left about 1935, probably in Yosemite, or they had these big conferences. And she was British in background. Eventually, he actually lived in China much later. And this is a funeral for leading a delegation from India, a guy who had gone to China actually during the war and died of a heart attack in 1957, I'm pretty sure. It was Zhou Enlai and Sun Jingling and the Indian ambassador. In the Cultural Revolution, of course he suffered. His wife died of cancer, relatively untreated. And it's like with so many, generally everybody, it was a bad scene. He also, the famine earlier, he has an account of as well, although he was in the city protected, but he got very, they got quite sick because they had the food was, very scarce, even for intellectuals in Beijing. In the Cultural Revolution, at first he's under sort of office arrest, and that's when his wife died. It was just awful. And then sent to a May 7th cadre school, which, since he'd been in the countryside a lot, didn't bother him too much. But his glaucoma in his glass in his eyes was totally untreated. So he left when the Cultural Revolution was over, and he went, well, sort of over. He was allowed to go back to Beijing to that collapsed old house. In 71, he was blind, basically. And so when I knew him, he could see vague images, but he was basically, he couldn't really read. He wrote kind of, but blindly. What he did, though, he didn't stop. He published I think it's 13 volumes, maybe it's later volumes, that he brought together with some other old guys, or collective history of Chinese workers abroad, Hua Gong. And I used to see it in Beijing bookstores, and it was published about 1980 finally. He thought it was very important, the role of overseas Chinese workers globally, everywhere. And he had gotten interested in that earlier, but never did anything to it. Now he's doing it. Plus, he taught English to high cadres, to people who were wandering the streets during the Cultural Revolution, who were from these fancy families in Beijing, like Liu Shaqi's children and others. This is with some of them in about 1973 or something. And this is in 66, just before everything got bad, with the family of his wife's sister, really, and his nephews and and so on. And there's some people, there's young boys there who later were my student. This is in the 70s. One last sort of episode I wanted to get to. In the 80s, when I knew him, well, he was involved in the establishment of the Shiqi Jingqi Guanbao. Came out of Shanghai with reforms of the 1980s. He got back into that with Wan Lei and Xue Muqiao and so on. But the other thing was there was a woman named Lisa Wexler who became through friends, and partially I sometimes think it's my fault too, recommended to him as a sort of English secretary, because he was getting correspondence from around the world and he would dictate a letter and that kind of thing. And she was studying for a PhD in economic policies of the 50s. Lisa also was having affairs with various Chinese students who were interested in the same thing, I guess you could say. I won't go into who some of them were, but one of them you have heard of, Shen Hansheng. Well, I said affair. Maybe I shouldn't push it that far. I think indeed it was, but I don't say that in the book. You may know the story. Shen Hansheng is now one of the most famous scholars of modern China's history, especially in current events. Sort of on the edge. He's an edgy guy. Anyway, quite a personality. He's been to Washington a lot, and Woodrow Wilson, on and on. He is in prison for 2 years because there were the Nebu documents found in Chen Hansheng's place, but also in his place, that were some that Lisa had, and they thought that Lisa was working for the American embassy, that she was a spy. And within 3 or 4 days, she was kicked out of China. It was in the international press, so I could follow it that way. The international press thought it was a trade because there were some, quote, Chinese spies in the CIA that we threw out. But anyway, so in the case of Shen Hansheng, and maybe you know the story after that, he's even written about the end of the story more. I mean, I know him. I think we have a good relationship. And he knows I know all about it because we were living in China and in and out, and Lisa was quite close to my wife. So anyway, he goes south. He Shanghai's and makes a lot of money selling, I think it's jewelry and gold and God knows what, down in Guangdong, Macau, Guangdong, makes a lot of money fast and buys the Russian archives in Moscow, essentially, all kinds of international communist archives, and starts writing. Now, he'd been kicked out of academia in China, totally, and his wife had left it, in this thing. He got going again. And now, of course, he's a joint famous professor at Huadong Shida and Beijing University and God knows where. And he got embraced again. But he has published, you must have some Shen Hansheng books here. There is June 4th, 1989, and he was extremely upset about that. And he was living in Mushudi, where most of the people were killed, right underneath this apartment he was now living in. He thought he was seeing zhuanji raised troops all over again, shooting students, and he never really recovered from that. Now, he was already in his 90s and really didn't do anything, shall we say, about it. Somebody asked me when I talked about this, why didn't he go on television or something? Well, he was pretty old. I mean, to do that. Anyway, so he stayed angry till he died. Really, basically, and I would see him through all of that. So anyway, I hope now you can sort of see why there's a lot of Chinese history in what we've been talking about from things you might not have heard much about. I hope. Also, people ask me about the title, Romantic Revolutionary, and they object to it sometimes. And my defense is that I think he was the old style Agnes Smedley, but also M.N. Roy, Li Dachao himself, Ho Chi Minh, believed in the international revolution. Very anti-imperialist in thrust. William Munzenberg, if you've ever heard of him, and others. So I think that's why I went in that direction. Some people say, no, wait a minute, what are you talking about? But anyway, that's my defense of that. But you can see it's a fascinating subject. I didn't know if I was going to finish this book. I interviewed a lot of people who knew him and collected a huge bibliography of a lot of things. He wrote a tremendous amount. So there's all that. It's a remarkable life. Illustrates, as I said, there's an international dimension to the Chinese Revolution. There are other figures. Like I mentioned, all these students in the 40s and so forth. And we somehow see the Chinese Revolution as a domestic thing. The peasants stand up. Okay, thank you very much. And I'm sorry I went on so long.
I'm curious about when you are talking to him, what kind of character is he? Do you have some special stories that you found that can represent his character and that may help him to survive all those kind of turmoils of the 20th century?
That's a good question, and I think maybe I'm not too good on that in the book. He was extremely talkative and interested in people, an extrovert in a variety of languages and so on, but also he had a good sense of humor. And I think Rebecca remembers his laugh. He had the damnedest laugh. Go all the time, you know. It was always making jokes and playing around. When I knew him, he had a sister from a different mother who was 20 years younger who was sort of trying to take care of him. And they were just joking around all the time. When he had visitors, he also made jokes all the time. So I think in some ways humor might have helped in the long run. And he didn't take himself real seriously, you know, at least overtly. Of course he was proud of and had an ego like anybody, but I think that might have helped, that long life. He also lived at the end, I must say, by two doctors who were the children of the sister. They never let him go to a hospital. They said, no hospital, you know, once he got into the night, no hospital. So that might have added 6 or 7 years. I don't know if you'd buy that, but, you know, that's another sort of odd theory about it. Thank you for the question.
All right. Thanks for everybody. And
thank you for coming. I'm afraid I talked too long.